Attention, you're listening to the Todd Huff Radio Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be advised that the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. Here's your conservative, but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Hey everybody, this is actually John Crane. I get the pleasure of being able to sit in the guest chair today for Todd. It's always a pleasure to be able to get on the show and share a little bit about what's going on in the world and in our nation. And I'm so grateful for my good friend Todd Huff to be able to share this opportunity with me. It's always a privilege to be able to come before you and talk a little bit. Obviously, there has been a lot going on, and of course, one of the most recent things that came to my mind was the recent Super Bowl, which in and of itself, I would argue, unless you're a true football fan, the game itself was relatively forgettable. But I came into the game and people were asking me, well, who are you pulling for? Well, I'm a huge Colts fan, and so I'm an anybody but the Patriots fan in that situation. So I was absolutely pulling for Seattle. I'm glad to see them pull it off. And I just, the thing that got my attention actually was the big story that was coming into the Super Bowl, which had less to do with the two teams that were playing and more to do with the halftime show. Bad Bunny was the NFL-sponsored halftime performer, and he generated a lot of controversy, which drew a lot of attention to the show, even from people that otherwise might not be oriented towards football. But what caught my attention is that Turning Point USA, which was the late Charlie Kirk's organization, and it's still thriving and doing great work. When Bad Bunny was announced, they put wheels in motion to offer an alternative. And so they put together a halftime show that was headlined by Kid Rock and some other largely country singers. That was the All-American halftime show put on by TPUSA. And so when we got to halftime, my family and I transitioned over to YouTube to watch that particular show, and really enjoyed it. Appreciated the songs from the different artists there. It was a much more wholesome halftime show than normally audiences have been subjected to over many decades. And even appreciated Kid Rock's song there at the very end that made allusions to Christ and the importance of Christ. But also what caught my attention was the very appropriate tribute that they did to Charlie Kirk there at the end of that halftime show. And if you didn't see it, I'd encourage you to go back and watch it. It brought to my mind the fact that it hasn't really actually been that long ago since we lost Charlie. And I know when that particular tragedy hit, I was asked to speak to a number of groups in talking about what happened and memorializing Charlie and all of those things. And I remember specifically on September the 10th of 2025, I was driving to Taylor University to speak to a group of young leaders there and was actually on the interstate when it came over the radio that he'd been shot. At that time, I didn't know, nobody knew that ultimately that was an assassination and that he would lose his life. But by the time I got to the campus, it had been confirmed that he was no longer with us. And for the group of college students that I was talking to, who generally skew more conservative anyway, the loss of Charlie Kirk was a major issue. There were so many young people that have watched his videos over the years and have really resonated with not just his particular philosophy of life and even his spiritual journey, but also his willingness to engage any audience and ask the tough questions and really listen, actually, as he did his college tour. And I know that for many people, when I talk to them for the next week or two or even month, the death of Charlie Kirk really hit in a very, very different kind of way. And it begs the question, why? What was it about Charlie's death that really hit us? And all of this came kind of surging back to me while I watched the end of that halftime show. And I reflected on my thoughts and my feelings in the immediate aftermath of Charlie's death. Not the least of which is I think it hit harder for us because it confirmed what many of us have been feeling for a long, long time. And that is that something is seriously wrong with what's happening in the United States. Whether it was the BLM protests back in 2020 or the COVID mandates or these assassinations or school shootings, and even more recently all the violence and protests that we see with the ICE issue, there's just been this sense of not just discontent, but that there is something deeply fractured in the United States. And where we are, supposed to be the United States of America, it feels very much like we are, in many respects, the divided people of America. And I think it should cause us to really reflect on that. So I want to share a little bit about that and my perspective, and not just identifying the problem, but really trying to walk us to a place where we can perhaps look at some solutions for that. I know for some of you who have heard me here on the radio before, you may know that I served as a senator in the state of Indiana for 8 years and term limited myself just a little over a year ago. And so I'm now a recovering politician. But it gives me a different perspective as I have regular political therapy sessions with current or former colleagues on what's happening in the political space. My biggest passion, if you've listened to me at all, is leadership development and really a values-driven, legacy-focused approach to leadership. When people ask me why I stepped out of the Senate, my big answer focused on this idea that politics is downstream from culture. And as I've often said, that begs the question, what is upstream? And upstream is the war of worldviews. It's the battle for thought leadership. Whoever wins that battle, the ideal war, wins the game. And that's why understanding these deeper issues, these deeper kind of existential questions about worldview and who we are and whether there's a God and whether there's truth and whether there's a right or wrong way to live, or, what is our purpose and meaning in life. These are all those fundamental building blocks that have gotten shaken over subsequent generations. And I think those are the kinds of things when we see, arguably a lone assassin decide one day to get on the top of a building and take out somebody like Charlie Kirk simply because he didn't agree with his line of thinking or his speech. That's not just tragic in terms of the loss of human life. That's tragic in terms of the things that we say we value here in the United States, not the least of which is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the ability to be able to express ourselves, which actually comes from, or theoretically comes from, a deeper valuing of human life. And of course, in the United States, the abortion issue has been raging for over 50 years, even before 1973 in the Roe v. Wade case. And I know that there's been large pushback in that regard. I was part of the effort in 2022 in Indiana to become the first state after the Dobbs decision to overturn abortion. But the abortion question, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, all these things get back to what do we really believe about human beings? Do they have inherent human value? As somebody who believes fervently in God and that God is the creator and sustainer of life, that God is the one that, because he designed us and created us, gives us purpose and meaning and value, I firmly believe that every human being has that innate sense of worth. And yet, that is one of those upstream questions that is debated and battled incessantly and has been for many generations. I bring all this up because I also am privileged to be able to serve on the National Board of Directors for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And this is an organization that actually was birthed out of Prison Fellowship Ministries, both of which were ultimately founded by Chuck Colson. He came to prominence in the Watergate scandal. He was part of the Nixon administration and then got caught up in the Watergate scandal and ultimately went to prison, where God got a hold of him and really radically changed his life and his heart. And it was through all that he founded Prison Fellowship Ministries, which is the largest prison ministry in the world. And then they began to realize, the leadership there, that the recidivism rate was too high, and they began to look upstream. What is it that is happening upstream that is causing this recidivism rate downstream to be so high? And that's where he began to pivot his focus on worldview, and particularly the Christian worldview. And as I often say with audiences, the Christian worldview is not just a slice of reality. It's not just part of the whole. It is reality. The better that we understand reality, the better that we understand how God originally designed this system to work, the better we're able to live within it. I'm reminded of this quote from the very famous C.S. Lewis, who wrote Mere Christianity. He also wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, the Screw Tape Letters, many other wonderful books. He said this in regard to Christianity, and it's always resonated with me ever since I first read it. He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it," he's referencing the sunrise, "but because by it I see everything else." He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I can see everything else." That's that same idea, that once we understand the Christian worldview, then we have a greater understanding of what's happening in the world, both the good that we should pursue, but also a better understanding of why so many bad things happen, why we hurt each other so badly or kill each other, why we try to one-up each other. And all of that doesn't automatically solve those problems, but it helps us begin to diagnose the problem so that we can ultimately pursue a solution. And so with the Colson Center, we recently partnered with Focus on the Family and put out a documentary in early September. Some of you who are listening may be aware of the Truth Rising documentary. And if you are not aware of it, I would highly recommend that you go check it out. It's truthrising.com, I believe, or maybe .org, Truth Rising. And this documentary is about 90 minutes, and it's largely divided into two segments. The first segment is the illustrious Os Guinness, who is a social commentator and author. He's written a ton of books, and he is in his 80s, and he is reflecting on where we are as a civilization. Now, many of the comments that he shares in the first half of that book, as he literally does a world tour and interviews different people around the world, come from one of his most recent books called Our Civilizational Moment. And his general kind of thesis is centered around this fundamental idea that, as he says, we as a people have come to a civilizational moment. We as Western civilization have come to this civilizational moment. You think of it as kind of a fork in the road and saying, okay, here we are at this fork in the road, and we have a choice to make. Which way are we going to go? And so he has a lot of these interviews with some leading thought leaders from around the world who affirm this idea that we're at really a civilizational crisis moment. But then the second half is a breakdown of a variety of downstream stories where the civilizational moment is in play. And so many of you might be aware of Jack Phillips out of Colorado, who is the cake baker that ultimately went to the Supreme Court. And even though he won that case and has the freedom to be able to make his cakes and turn down certain cakes because of religious reasons, he was sued again. And so he's still battling there. There is Chloe Cole, who was a young lady who in high school, I believe it was, decided to transition and become a man. She struggled with gender dysphoria, And so she went through a mastectomy, and all of a sudden realized as she got older that that was not what she wanted and wasn't in her best interest. She actually came back around and re-embraced faith, and now she's become a leading spokeswoman in her generation, helping other people who are struggling. And there's a variety of other downstream stories that are validating where we are as a civilization. Now, why do I bring all that up? I bring all that up because I firmly believe with Os Guinness and so many of these emerging thought leaders that we are, in fact, at a civilizational moment. Now, whether we want to be here or not, whether we, would rather live at a different time and place in history, it doesn't matter what I desire. The fact of the matter is we are here right now, and I can't help but think about that famous line from the book of Esther when her cousin Mordecai famously says to Esther, "Perhaps God has brought you here for such a time as this." And when I think about the United States, I, in my kind of post-Senate role, have had many opportunities to be able to travel around the world and speak in a variety of places all over the world to different leaders. I recently was speaking in the Hungarian parliament for a prayer breakfast there, and so I get to meet all these really fascinating people, and I'm not always sure how I end up in the room, but I'm there. And as I talk with different folks from around the world, it continues to reinforce the elevated status that the United States has. As I've often said, it's so easy for us to take for granted the many blessings that we have here in the United States, particularly if we are natural-born citizens. If we grow up here in the United States and we don't have that broader point of comparison that so many people around the world have, it's so easy for us to take the freedoms for granted, to take the protections for granted, to take the system of government for granted. This idea of freedom and democracy and validating the voice of a human being, hundreds of years ago, that wasn't even on the radar. The thought of, giving somebody a voice or valuing women, for example, that isn't even on the radar. And there are countries today where that still isn't on their radar, right? And so it's so easy for us to take these things for granted and to not fully appreciate how blessed we truly are. And yet the difficulty when we take things for granted is that we don't realize, as our founding fathers firmly understood, that we will never be able to keep these freedoms if we don't continue to stay vigilant and keep an eye on them and try to shore up where they're slipping and, if necessary, continue to fight for them. That's why we hold in such regard and high honor men and women in the military who have served ably and faithfully and nobly on our behalf to protect the freedoms that we have. And we're so grateful for them. I'm blessed to have both of my parents, one of whom is deceased, my father, who served in the Army and actually met during the Vietnam War. And so was privileged to be able to live in the Crane household where elevation of patriotism in the military was just a foregone conclusion. That's what we were all about because we recognized the value of those who serve in the military or closer to home, those who serve in law enforcement to protect us and to watch over us. And yet things that I would take for granted in growing up are not the same things that we can easily take for granted today. There is that fracturing. There is that breaking down of these kind of bedrock ideas and foundational freedoms that if we do not get serious about shoring them up, then the trajectory that many of us sense that we are on is only going to accelerate, and our children and our grandchildren are going to feel the brunt of it even more. And so as I make my way around the world, I realize this fundamental truth that as goes the United States, so goes the world. And I firmly believe that because we still hold such sway. For good or for ill, the United States holds such sway in the world today. Well, as somebody who is privileged to live here in the state of Indiana, we're often referred to as the heartland. And I firmly believe that, as goes the heartland, so goes the country. As goes the country, so goes the world. And that's not to disparage anybody else who lives in our nation, because we each have a role to play here in the United States to not only teach the next generation these fundamental values and principles, but to equip them to not simply survive going forward, but, Lord willing, to thrive. And that's going to take some effort. Right? So one of the things that my wife and I talk about a lot, she is a licensed mental health therapist. She's been doing that for almost 25 years. And so one of the big conversations that we have now is with technology. We're blessed to have 4 children who are almost all out of the house. We have one that's married, 2 that are in college, and our daughter is still a junior in high school, and she's quickly making her way through high school and will be out soon. And so we have opportunities from time to time to be able to come alongside other parents and speak to groups of parents who are trying to raise their kids in the right way. And of course, this tech conversation is a big part of that. How do we tackle tech with our kids? And how do we tackle AI and all those kinds of things? And how do we tackle all the forces that are on the internet, the temptations that are on the internet, all that stuff? And one of the things that I often bring up to audiences is that fundamental question with parents in particular is, before we start talking about tech, let's talk about the bigger picture, and that is, who do we want our kids to be? For grandparents, who do we want our grandchildren to be? What is the kind of person that we want them to become? And are we willing to do what is often going to require very difficult things, the hard things, the saying no to certain things, the discipline? Are we willing to do the hard things necessary to set them on a path towards thriving, to set them on a path towards flourishing? Well, we can't pass along to our kids and our grandkids something that we haven't fully wrestled with ourselves. And that's why this fundamental idea of being at this kind of crossroads of our civilizational moment is so important. Because we've got to be able to wrestle through ourselves, okay, what am I going to choose to do in terms of trying to better myself and trying to better the people around me, trying to exert influence where I can, and then who are the people that are in my sphere of influence with whom I can pass that along. There's much more to be said. We're going to continue this conversation after the break, so don't go away. We'll be right back here on the Todd Huff Show. Hey everybody, this is John Crane. I'm guest hosting today for Todd Huff, and it's such a privilege to be able to be on the radio with you wherever you're listening across our great nation. We're so grateful to have you be a part of this audience. We've been talking about this idea of being at a civilizational moment. It comes out of Os Guinness's book, Our Civilizational Moment, and it's also part of some of the content that was out of a recently released documentary called Truth Rising. And if you haven't seen that documentary, I would strongly encourage you to go find it online. Truth Rising is online and is available. It's free. It is a partnership between Focus on the Family and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And one of the other pieces to that is really valuable, in addition to the documentary itself, is there's also a video series, a 4-part video series that has videos and also content, so you can work through that yourself or work through that with a group and get some of the fantastic teaching from John Stonestreet over at the Colson Center. Well, we were talking about this because we find ourselves at this civilizational moment. We find ourselves at this kind of intersection of decision-making, and it's very easy for us to look and say, hey, somebody ought to do something about this or that, whatever the problem is that's in front of us. I know when I served as a senator, there's no shortage of people who came forward and were more than happy to tell me all the problems and things that they felt like needed to be addressed and things that I was not getting right. Typically, they very very few times would they come and say, hey, great job. It was usually, here's where you're falling short. But we certainly see the problems, and we know that there's work to be done. And right before the break, we were talking about this importance of really raising up the next generation and helping them understand the Christian worldview, helping them understand, as we said, that it's not just a slice of reality, that it is reality, and that once you understand that, you can better find your place and your position in the world and find God's path. Well, one of the things that I often talk about with people is this idea, as leaders in particular. I do a lot of leadership training these days, and we talk about this idea of being on mission or having a on-mission mindset. I know when I came into the Senate, I sat down with our chaplain, and I told him I'm not really here to be a senator, actually. I'm here to be a catalyst for redemptive good in the political arena. And I shared more about what I meant by that, and that was my mindset for the 8 years that I was privileged to serve as a senator in the state of Indiana, that I truly wanted to be a catalyst for redemptive good in that arena. And so every day as I came into the State House and I would kind of pray the same prayer, it was an attempt to get my mind right before I stepped into that arena. Well, every single one of us has the ability to have influence. And in order for us to have the right kind of influence, we have to understand the upstream worldview. We have to understand this idea of values, right? We talk about we need values, values-based leadership, and that is really, really important. But values are it's a common assumption that value by when we say values, we mean positive, right? It's always positive. Well, values are a neutral idea, right? There's positive and negative values. The question is simply, what do you value? And are your values the right values? Well, that's where the Christian worldview comes into play, because the God as not only the ultimate creative designer is also the moral lawgiver. And he's the one that has set up the system. He's set up the worldview as the way in which we should live. And therefore, as we wrestle with, am I somebody who has values? Hopefully the answer is yes. But then the obvious next question is, okay, are my values the right values? In order for me to have influence, I have to know and live my values, but I also have to understand that my values are the right ones, and God is the one that determines that. But at its most basic level, I have people ask me all the time, what is leadership? What does it mean? Many of you out there probably wrestle with that, or you're leaders in your own way. Leadership is about intentional influence, plain and simple. And because of that, I don't necessarily buy into this idea that there are leaders and non-leaders, right? So-and-so is a leader. I don't really see myself like them, so I'm not really a leader. Or, the fundamental debate, are leaders born or made? I don't look at it in that way. I simply view leadership and leaders as there are leaders and there are potential leaders. And the only difference between a potential leader and an actual leader is that the actual leader chose to lead. And that matters, because if leadership is about intentional influence, that means leadership is a choice. That means every single one of us can get up every day and say, I choose to have influence today with whoever it is that crosses my path. I don't necessarily need to have a title or a position. We buy into that misconception sometimes. Well, when I get to be in such and such position, or when I have the title of senator or the title of CEO or the title of captain of my team or whatever it is, then I can actually be a leader. Well, certainly those titles and positions expand our sphere of influence, but they don't define our ability to have influence within that sphere. And so when we think about this idea, there's a book by Mark Sandberg called I Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader. And he's exactly right? Our positional influence assumes influence can only happen with one's title or position. But what I'm talking about is personal influence. And that assumes that influence can always happen regardless of one's title or position. It's not simply defined by one's title or position. It's the same concept that John Maxwell talks about in his book, 360-Degree Leader, right? That you can be a leader at any point with any person, anywhere in your organization. And why is that? Because it's based on your mindset. And so the question is, do each one of us have a bias towards action? We can sit around and complain about what's happening in the world today and wish somebody would do something about it. And we often look to our political leaders. If they would just vote the right way, then we can save the nation. Well, we certainly need the right kind of political leaders to vote the right way. And that's going to influence our nation. But, as Chuck Colson often said, salvation is not coming on Air Force One. Right? And for those of us that understand the Christian faith and have faith, we recognize that our salvation is not coming from a what, it's coming from a who, and has already been determined by the saving grace of Jesus Christ. But what does that mean for us? Well, that means we still have a role to play. There are still things that we need to be doing. And one of those is this idea of having an on-mission mindset. I'm reminded of this story of all the way back in 1962. President John F. Kennedy was visiting NASA, and this was the very beginning of the space race. He had cast this vision of getting a man on the moon. And as the story goes, he was taking a tour of the facility, and he encountered a man with a mop. Well, he extended his hand to this janitor, and he said, "Hi, I'm Jack. What are you doing?" To which the janitor confidently replied, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." Well, that conversation happened in 1962, and it was evident that that man was very clear about what his mission was and how his role was accomplishing the larger mission of putting the man on the moon. For those of you who know your history, it wasn't until 1969 that Neil Armstrong actually was the first man to ever step on the moon. And so it took over 7 years to reach that goal. But it was obvious by that janitor's mindset that he was locked in. And everybody on the team got locked in to be able to accomplish what up until that point had seemed impossible. Well, it's the same thing for us as we live life, right? We need to have an on-mission mindset. We need to get up every day and say, okay, what's the mission today? And I would challenge you, no matter where you are out there, what is your life mission, right? What are you about? If someone were to ask you, hey, what are you about? How would you answer that? What is your why for why you get up? If you're not clear about that, that's okay. But I would still encourage you to walk through that and say, okay, what is it that drives me every day? What do I want to see accomplished? And what can I do to be a part of finding success and solutions for the many problems that we're faced with? The challenge is, do we have that on-mission mindset in our life? Do we recognize that we have been given a sphere of influence that allows us to be able to have impact? For many of us who have jobs or are working in different fields, we might have an understanding of what the mission is because the mission is contextual. We're blessed here in the state of Indiana that our football team finally, after forever in the wilderness, won the national championship. And so Coach Signetti recognized and took his team on the journey to accomplish a contextual mission, which was winning the last game of the season. Well, any coach who's in sports recognizes that that's the mission, winning the last game of the season. But the question becomes, okay, contextually that might be what we're trying to accomplish. That's the mission. But is there also an ultimate mission? Is there something that transcends our particular context? And that's where the impact of worldview thinking and worldview application should come into play. That no matter what my particular context, I recognize that God has placed me here for such a time as this because He's got big things that He wants to see accomplished. And so I've got to get on with the mission today, no matter where He's placed me. Well, we got to take another break, but we'll be right back. So don't go anywhere. We'll be here on the Todd Huff Radio Show. Hello, friends. This is John Crane sitting in for Todd Huff today. We've been having a conversation about standing at our civilizational moment and deciding what are we going to do about it. It's very easy for us to look to other people to try to find the solutions for what's happening in our world, and certainly we do have leaders that we can and should be looking to, but it's a team sport, right? Leadership is a team sport, and we each have a role to play. And right before the break, we were talking about this important idea that leadership is about intentional influence, and therefore leadership is a choice. That there is, in my mind, not a difference between a leader and a non-leader. It's simply a leader and a potential leader. And the actual leader is the one that's made the choice to have influence, to exert influence every day. And it's important for us to be on mission, to recognize that God has put us here, and He's got people that He wants us to interact with, and He's got key ideas and key things that He wants us to accomplish, but we can't do that if we don't fully understand what the mission is. And so, as we were saying in the last segment, it's important for us to be clear about what our values should be and recognize that our values, properly understood, should be aligned with God's value. And because of that, then, we've got the framework by which we can go out and add value or bring good into the world. Well, I've been talking about the Truth Rising documentary, and my good friend John Stonestreet, who's the president of the Colson Center, is part of the video series that accompanies that. That's a great small group resource for any of you out there. But in his book, Restoring All Things, which he co-wrote with Warren Cole Smith, they pose a series of questions, 4 questions, that I want to leave with you today. Because it's very easy for us to be up at 50,000 feet and go, man, there's a lot of bad things happening in our country. Somebody should do something. And just stay up there and feel helpless or maybe even discouraged. But I would argue that, we don't necessarily need to worry about changing the world. What I think we ought to do is just be looking at our little corner of the world and seeing what God has for us where we are every single day, and recognizing that He's placed people across our paths. And so these are 4 questions I want to leave with you as you think about your own space and your own influence. John Stonestreet and Warren Cole Smith write this: key questions. Number 1, what is the good in our culture that we can promote, protect, and celebrate? So as we pursue good things, where can we see good that we can promote, protect, and celebrate? Number 2, what is missing in our culture that we can creatively contribute? So as we just watch life and watch, our particular place in the world, what is our contribution? What is something where we might see a gap that we can address? Number 3, and this is super important, what is evil in our culture that we can stop? Well, we don't have to look very far to see that there are serious problems, and not just at a national level or an international level. In every single one of our communities, there are bad things that are happening. There are people who are suffering, and as John has often said, and I quote him all the time on this, ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And so there are plenty of victims that we might see if we have our eyes to look. So what is the evil in our culture that we can stop? And finally, what is broken in our culture that we can restore? God has placed us here for such a time as this and has allowed us to be co-creators on this journey. That we can be people who are guardians, that we stand up against evil and things that are wrong, and we stand up for people and we stand up for truth. And we can certainly be restorers. Restoration assumes brokenness, right? That there's a broken whatever it is. It could be a plate, or it could be a system, or it could be a team, or it could be a culture, or it could be a business. There are broken marriages, broken relationships. How can we be agents of restoration with our own lives and with the people that are around us? And that's what I would challenge each of you with. As we walk through life, and we are posing these 4 questions, right? What's the good that we can promote? What's the creative contribution that we can make? What's the evil that we can stop? And what's the restoration that we can pursue? I'll bet if we got serious about asking that and really got the eyes to see, we would find that there are opportunities every day for every single one of us to make our contribution to shore up what's happening in our nation, the breakdown that's happening. I don't necessarily need to solve every marriage in the country, but I can be working on my marriage. And if my marriage happens to be in a season of strength, I can come alongside newly marrieds, or I can come alongside people who are struggling in their marriage and try to help them. I can be working on my kids and my family and trying to help other families who are trying to raise kids in a very difficult environment. But I've got to be willing to take the step. I've got to be willing to make the choice, to have that bias towards action and to choose every single day, hey, I am going to get out there and I am going to be on mission. So that's my encouragement and my challenge to each one of us. It's a challenge that I put to myself every day and put to our kids, that we'll be a friend to those that need a friend today and we'll be leaders and not just followers. They've heard me pray that every single day, and that's my prayer for you. If I can be of help to any of you, come find me at craneleadership.org. That's C-R-A-N-E, leadership.org. My deepest desire is to come alongside leaders and empower leaders to get better at becoming their best. And I'm so grateful to be able to spend this time with you. We'll look forward to seeing you again here on the Todd Huff Show.